Hi, my name's Chris, and I'd like to thank CancerStories for inviting me here today to talk about what is a very complex case and has been quite difficult for me personally for the last 8 years since my cancer was diagnosed. Cancer has taken an awful lot from my life, but it's also given me a lot of positive things, and that's really the message that I'd like to give to your viewers today. And thank you again for inviting me. Hi, my name's Chris, I'm 59, I've been married for about 37 years. I have 2 adult boys, one who still lives at home and one who's married. And I also have 2 grandchildren, a granddaughter and a grandson. In my life before cancer, I was a self-employed business consultant. I spent my life travelling the world, having fun, earning a lot of money, driving fast cars and eating in some fancy places. I would consider myself to be a maverick, as I've never really worked for anybody for a long time. I'm not sure that I'm employable. But I was a very independent guy until 2007 when I was diagnosed with my cancer.
Chris, thanks for coming to join us on CancerStories. We appreciate you making the effort to come from London today. I understand you have been diagnosed, well, a while ago now, with quite a rare cancer. It's one of the hematological cancers, a lymphoma, but a mantle cell lymphoma. How did that come about initially?
Actually, it was a great shock for me, I must be honest. I was diagnosed at the age of 51, and I'd never previously been sick. So I never attended my doctor. I'd never even been to a hospital as an inpatient. But I started to feel quite tired when I was working, but I put that down to just working hard. And then after that, my groin and my arms started to ache. And in the middle of the night, according to my wife, I was sweating as the bed was absolutely damp in the morning. But I thought that was all signs of stress and maybe overwork, so we decided to take a holiday, and we went off to a nice luxurious resort in the Middle East to try and resolve those tiredness issues. But actually that only made things worse, and by the time I got back, my wife, encouraging is probably not strong enough word, pushed me to the doctor to go and have some tests. And when I saw the GP, he said, "Oh, welcome, Mr. Lewis. We don't see you very often," as he was dusting off my file. And I explained to him my symptoms, and he said, "We must do some very urgent tests," which he did. And the next day, I was showering, getting ready to go to work, and the phone rang. And it was my GP personally, which I was quite shocked at. And he told me that I had to go to hospital straight away. He'd made an appointment at our general hospital, local hospital, that I needed to see a consultant there. Once I'd seen the consultant, they did some more tests, and they put a camera down my throat, and they found that my tonsils were swelling. And she said, "Mr. Lewis, you have remarkably large tonsils." And I said, "That's probably because I talk a lot." And she said, "It's not for that reason, but we need to remove them because they're going to strangle you." So they did an urgent operation a few days later to take out my tonsils. Once that was done, I was quite happy, and actually I felt a lot better and went back to work, which is the main love of my life, other than my good lady, of course. And a couple of weeks later, I got a phone call from the hospital And they said, Mr. Lewis, we need you to come back and see us. And I thought, wow, this is remarkable service from the NHS. You know, everybody criticises the NHS, and here I am having what I would consider to be a relatively simple operation of someone removing my tonsils. And they want to check up on me. And I said to my wife, this is a wonderful thing. But my wife, she had the woman's intuition, I think. And she said, I want to come with you to that appointment. And I said, I don't need that. I don't need you holding my hand. But she came along. And at the appointment, I was met by a very official looking gentleman in a very sharp suit. And I was even more impressed. And he took me into his office. And he looked in my throat and he said, things are healing up nicely, Mr. Lewis. That's very good. But unfortunately, we did some tests on your tonsils, and we found you have mantle cell lymphoma stage 4. And at that stage, he might as well have been talking Mandarin, because I didn't understand a word that he said. I didn't know what it was. I said, what is this? And he said, actually, it's cancer. So I said, but you can do something, right? And he said, maybe, but we can't cure it. We can treat it. And I said, what's this stage 4 business? And he said, actually, there isn't any stage 5. So it then sunk in quite quickly how things were looking for me. He said, we need to do a very urgent scan. He said, we recommend that we're going to give you up to 8 sessions of aggressive chemotherapy, and we need to start that quickly. And your only hope after that is a stem cell transplant, if we can find a match for you. So things accelerated then. I had my scans, and the cancer had gone everywhere, basically. It was in my groin, under my arms, it was even on my bowel. So I was covered in tumours. And the chemotherapy started. So that's the sort of diagnosis situation, really.
Mm. So you had that massive shock of having a cancer, which you didn't understand at the time. It was pretty much kind of out of the blue, the diagnosis. You'd had those symptoms, but you didn't know what it was due to. And then you were facing a massive amount of treatment, which was with no promise of a cure at all. In fact, your cancer was diagnosed in quite an advanced state, from what you say. How did the actual treatment go when you started with the chemotherapy?
The treatment was tough. I considered myself as a mentally and physically able person, and I was in reasonable shape when I started my treatment. But very quickly, the chemotherapy took me down. Mm. And on the first session, I was taking a real cocktail of drugs that were all funny colours, all colours of the rainbow. And psychologically, I think it affected me to see bright red and bright luminous colours going into my arm. And then when I used to go to the loo, you know, that colour was coming out. And it was truly shocking. And the first night I was sick, and it was all colours of the rainbow. It was very, very frightening. And my wife was frightening. We'd made the decision to come home. The hospital offered to keep us there, but to be honest, I'd had about 6 hours of chemo, and I really wanted to get home. And that was truly shocking. It was a real wake-up call to the toughness of the regime that I was going to be facing. But we went back to hospital the following day. We phoned them up, and they took us in and gave me some different anti-sickness stuff. And they changed my regime a little, and it became much more bearable. But those times were tough. I'll be honest, they were tough. Sitting in a chemo room with people in various degrees of health was tough. I'm quite a chirpy guy, and actually I didn't lose my chirpiness, but I was a little conscious that maybe not everybody wanted to be chirpy at that time.
Is there anything that could make that experience better? I'm thinking of other people going through that again now, hundreds, if not thousands of people every day throughout the country, internationally. We put people through a lot, and sometimes we don't think of the environment or the experience. Thinking back to what you had to go through, is there anything that could help, do you think?
I think in 2007, which was quite a time ago now, and to be fair, I think things have improved a lot from what I've seen to 2015. For me, I think it would have been helpful to have a little bit more privacy. Is my answer to that question. I think not just for myself. I'm not really a private guy. Actually, I'm quite an open guy. But I think for some other people there, who were very frightened of what was happening to them, and they were also seeing other people that were also frightened. I think so psychologically it was very tough for them. Not so much for myself, because I understood why it was like that.
Do you think there's a role to be introduced to other patients at that stage, like as a kind of mentorship system almost from day one? Or do you think the priority is receive the treatment, get the acute stages out of the way, and then look at supportive care later?
It's a great question, and I've seen both sides of that fence. And with hindsight, I would actually say there was an area for peer support. But in my personal case, and I think that applies to most of my people that I know that have gone through it and are still going through it, chemo, I think it's something that you're not really aware of the next stage because you're so busy focusing on the current stage. And I think the chemo and the treatment area, you've got to be a little selfish, in my opinion. You have to focus on yourself. And I would think that peer support may be at that stage a slight distraction from your own focus of trying to receive the treatment and trying to deal with all the psychological issues that you have. I think there is an area for it, but I'm not sure that is the right stage.
Okay, that's interesting. To what extent did the staff, I'm curious, ask you about your general well-being, as opposed to the need to have this regime, this dose, this time, attend regularly, the classic medical things?
There was none of that, none at all. The team of nurses, the team of doctors, which I had and still have the same team in fact, are all wonderful people, but in the real world they all work under pressure. Giving chemotherapy is a pressured situation. The drugs are made up, they've got to be used within a certain time. And I don't really feel there is the time for the staff. Look, my regime was fortnightly, so I very quickly started to build relationships with the nurses who were giving me chemo, and it was designed that the same nurse I saw each time I went. So that was great. We had a relationship. But it wasn't anything about my work or what I was going to do afterwards. She was doing her job. She did it brilliantly. She was lovely. She brought me water when I needed it. But that was as far as it went.
Okay.
No, there wasn't at any stage.
I heard you describe the chemotherapy, and after the chemotherapy, for you, I think, was a stem cell transplant.
Yes, it was.
Initially anyway. And that was essential in order to achieve control over your condition and go into remission, I guess. What was this story of stem cell transplant for people who don't know anything about it, or for patients who are watching this for the first time?
Well, firstly, stem cell transplant, I didn't have a match in my family, so they tested my family. There was no match for me. So they had to go to the transplant register, which is, I think people will know Anthony Nolan. So Anthony Nolan found me a match through various blood tests and etc. And that match took about 5 or 6 weeks. So the period of time, I mean, I wasn't going to survive without a transplant because my disease would have come back. That's what they told me. So I needed a transplant very urgently. And the waiting time between finishing my chemotherapy and finding out if there was a match for me in the world was an intensely nervous time because I had got into remission, but any day the disease could have come back. So finally the telephone rang and my coordinator at the hospital said, we have a match for you. But even then that was more complex because it was a young man of 22 actually in London, so I was quite fortunate. But even then the process began of getting this guy in to do more tests, further tests to make sure that he was a suitable donor. And thankfully he was. And so that process began. They got his cells just before Christmas. So I was taken into an isolation unit to begin my transplant. And what that involved was basically to give me more aggressive chemotherapy if I hadn't had enough already, to give me some really, really strong dose of that. So I had that for 10 days, 24/7 chemotherapy, to take me within an inch of my life, basically, to kill off my bone marrow, my existing bone marrow, which gave me the immune system, the great analogy is of a newborn baby. Okay, and I think we know how precious they are. So there was a 51-year-old guy in an isolation unit with the immune system of a newborn baby. So I had all the masks and everybody had suits on. It was like NASA with people coming and going. But that was a very vulnerable time, of course. And then on the 17th of December, so I had an early Christmas present, my stem cells were sent across London on a motorbike from the Royal Free Hospital. And my new life began, and they were given to me through a drip into my system. So day +1 was the 18th, and my new system started to grow. So it was a very emotional time going through that sort of process. Being in a room in isolation is in itself quite humbling, actually. There's plenty of time to think about your life, where you're going, what you've done. And then to be given a chance, because at that stage it was only a chance. There was a possibility my body would have even rejected those new cells. And whilst the cells were growing, that was a dreadful process too, because there were times I didn't know whether to put my head over the basin or to sit on the toilet or do both. It was quite a tough time physically. It was 24/7 care. Everything that came out of my body was monitored. If you can imagine, you can't imagine how dehumanizing actually something like that can actually be. And I found that really hard to adjust to. But the team were brilliant. I had a wonderful team that looked after me. They were the same continuous care. Day in and day out, but that was a very, very tough process. Not just the physical angle of it, but actually the psychological angle. I was in there for 6 weeks, and I had visitors, but for a bulk of that time I was hooked up to drugs, different anti-rejection stuff, different vitamins and different minerals and that sort of thing to try and make me stronger. Different foods I had to eat. It was a very, very tough time, I'd have to say.
I'm aware that this is quite a few years ago you underwent this, but did you have access to any resources that could take your mind off that isolation? I mean, the classic resource is your own friends and family, subject to restrictions if they're allowed. Another is, for you, I know it's a big issue now, social media can help a lot in terms of coping actually. But I doubt it was really available then, was it?
No, 2007. Actually, I just started. I'd got myself a little computer. I knew that I was going into hospital, and my first major disappointment was not about my health. Actually, it was about the fact there was no Wi-Fi in the room, and I was truly shocked that even in 2007 there was no Wi-Fi. And actually, the clinicians thought I was rather strange. You know, their issue was focusing on keeping me alive, and there I was worrying about whether I had internet access. But actually, it was an isolation unit in more ways than one, yeah. and without any contact to the outside world was quite difficult. But yes, you're right. Friends and family came in, but things have changed. I had my own television and things like that. But the greatest piece of advice I think I received at that time was by the nurses that said, bring some pictures in. We've got a memory board. So that was the only thing that I had in the room really, was a memory board. So I had pictures of my wife and my family. I had my house on there. I didn't know even I was coming out of the room. So I thought this might be the last time I see these things. So, and I had my car, I had a nice car then. And I had my Palace shirt, which I'm a Crystal Palace fanatic. And that used to cause humour amongst a lot of the nurses when I had my Palace shirt at the bottom of the bed. So yeah, we managed to get around it, but the memory board was a great tip. Really, yeah. That was a great tip.
Whilst you're on the topic of friends and family, what was the reaction of your family to your diagnosis, and how would you characterise their emotional state as time went on?
I think my wife understood it. So from the day of diagnosis, when I got that news, we were walking back to the tube station, and my first thought was work. Actually, because I've worked ever since I was 15, and I was talking to my wife about work as we were walking back to the tube, and she said, "Chris, why are you talking about work? You know, you might not even be living very long. You know, why are you talking about work?" And I said, because I always have done.
But for you, that was a key, important part of your life. You didn't want a threat to that, I guess.
Yeah, I was worried. No, I didn't want a threat to it. I was self-employed, right? So I knew of the risks, but it was sort of the risks that drove me anyway to do what I did. I think it helped me having that sort of edge to my work. But I was concerned financially because I knew that I wasn't going to get paid. So my intention was to work all the way through chemo, which I did. That was a psychological issue as much as a physical issue. I wanted to go toe to toe with this damn thing, and I certainly did my best to do that. But my wife got it quicker than I got it. In fact, I even told the doctor, or I asked the doctor, "Have you got the right file?" Because, you know, the name Lewis is quite common. You must have the wrong file, because bad things don't happen to me. But my wife got it. I didn't really get it for some period of time. I never really got frightened by it even. But it was difficult because to tell my boys, to tell my circle of friends, how to tell people, when to tell them, it's not something you just drop in an afternoon tea. And there was a priority of telling people, because you have a hierarchy, you know, I didn't realise it, but you have some hierarchy of friends. And so we tried to work out a strategy of how we had a family dinner, because that tends to be a nice thing. So unfortunately we had to tell the kids then about how bad things were, and then my friends and everybody was truly shocked, because I am a guy that nothing bad happens to. So it was truly shocking, and actually to this day, really, when I reflect on all the things that happened to me, and certainly the really serious times then, I still really sometimes wonder if it's a dream.
I know you were telling them in that early stage, but I'm just putting myself in your shoes. At that stage, you didn't know what the outcome was going to be. You didn't know you were going to go into remission, as you subsequently did for quite a few years, until the current time, in fact. So how kind of ruthlessly honest were you with the family and friends at that time?
Very ruthlessly honest.
Yeah.
I've always been a communicator. That's the way I've run my life. And I know everyone deals with cancer differently. Some people don't tell people at all. I even know husbands and wives that don't tell things about their cancer. But for me, one of the ways of dealing with it was actually telling people all about it. And I wanted people to know, because I didn't know what was going to happen to me. And so I wanted to tell them what was going on in case something started to happen, and so that they could recognise what was happening, really. So I've always been very open, and still am, with the things that are happening to me. I don't really want anything hidden. We were ruthlessly open. I asked the hospital, there was a little bit of a time in between my chemotherapy and my stem cell transplant where they were doing the tests on the donor. And I said to the hospital, right, what am I going to do with my time? Because I can't work and, I feel useless. What am I going to do with my time? And my consultant said, Mr. Lewis, please make sure your affairs are in order. So I think that those few words actually put the reality into my case.
That could be seen as harsh, but on the other side, you were able to make preparations if things did advance, which you might not have done if he hadn't have said that. And were you thinking at that stage, my condition is terminal or might be terminal?
There were two sides of my thoughts on that issue. Logic told me it was, because I saw the scans. They showed me the scans and I could feel the lumps and I knew what was happening to my body, and I knew pouring toxins into it is not going to do it any much better. But the other side of my mind went with, well, hold on, you've had 51 positive years, right? So actually this 1 or 2 years of rubbish, you might be able to deal with that. So actually, when I went in for my isolation period, which was 6 weeks, I said to my wife, I've got a job to do in here. This is another project for me. This is a work project. This is how I looked at it. So I'm going into this room, right? I'm going to be 6 weeks away. I'm going to do my job and I'm going to come out. I'm going to take what's given to me and I'm going to come out.
That's an interesting attitude. It's very determined, very, very solution focused. I'm just going to deal with whatever I have to deal with. That is my role right now. My role is to cope with the treatment that I have to have. It's a way of getting through it, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, I've always dealt with projects and problems, and I've always, part of my work is trying to come up with a solution to it. And obviously a lot of that stuff was out of my hands, but there were certain things that I could do to affect outcome, I felt. So I looked at it as another business project, basically. And I said to my wife and my kids, I said, there's going to be a lot of terrible stuff going on here, and there's going to be days I don't want you here. Not for me, but for you, right? So let me tell you when you can come and when you can't come, because there are some things I don't want to drag you down with.
When you're living with an illness like cancer, one of the real challenges is to maintain control over your life, especially in that acute stage where everything seems like it's being done to you, like you're almost a victim of the system. So many visits, so many administrations, so many scans. How do you keep your own, persona going? How do you keep your own role in those difficult times?
I think actually at first I found it difficult because it was coming at me, as you say, it was coming at me from everywhere. But the hospital made it slightly easier for me because my case was complex. So I had a coordinator, a bone marrow transplant coordinator, who was absolutely brilliant. She would arrange because I needed my heart testing, my lungs testing, my liver testing, all my vital organs, right? Even had a brain scan, I had a mouth scan to check whether my teeth and whether I had any infection in my gums. So I had and that is quite complex in a hospital to arrange all those appointments for suitable times. Laura did all that. She did all that for me. And so she helped me with that, and it became again like a business thing for me. So I saw the problems coming, and I tried to not take over the project. I couldn't do that; that was out of my hands. But I did try to have some input into it. I asked a lot of questions. I got a lot of information. I didn't trawl around the internet too much actually, because I had complete faith in the people that were dealing with me. My consultant is in fact world renowned in mantle cell lymphoma. How lucky was that? So I tried to be involved as much as I could in my own case. I asked what the drugs were going to do to me so that I knew what to expect to a degree. And in fact that's continued now, because I'm still, I would consider myself an active patient in my own care.
What was the next step for you after you put these treatments behind you? Your body had responded. You went into remission, I know that. How long until you felt you could return to your previous role? I mean, I know for you work was a big issue. Did you manage to get back to work initially in that period after your acute treatment?
Work was a massive issue for me, massive. I realise now in hindsight that work gives us some form of social identity. And actually it's quite funny, because I really thought I was somebody important when I went in. My phone was always ringing. I thought, the world wants me, the world wants Chris, you know, this is a good place to be. I must be doing something right. But once I went in, there was no mobile phone. And I saw lots of people walking around with their NHS gowns on, and I didn't know what they did for a living, they didn't know what I did for a living. And in that environment, we're all equal, right? We've all got our butts hanging out the back of these terrible gowns they give us. So I could have been next door to Sir somebody, or I could have been next door to Professor somebody, and we didn't really know. So I realised very quickly that actually I'm the same as the next guy, and I'm as frail as the next guy. So I still was, I got a lot of satisfaction from my work, and the fact that it was looking less and less likely, the fact that I would be able to do it, but I was physically so frail, was quite mentally upsetting. As much as anything else, actually, it was financially upsetting, because our household income had halved overnight virtually. So that left me in a place where I was still trying to negotiate things financially, where they were on top of me, and I wasn't really in a position to physically to go and do anything about it. I couldn't go and earn money, quite simply. So it was tough. It was tough dealing with the financial issues of that, and the psychological issues of not being able to work. As maybe a caveman, you know, my role was to go out and work, and I couldn't do that. That had been taken away from me. So that was a very, very tough time, and I felt my role in the house was diminished. You know, I couldn't dress myself. So when I left hospital, I was in remission, and you're absolutely right. But when I left those doors of that secure place, that was really when stage 2 of my journey, if you like, really began. That was the really, really tough side. Physically, it was tough in the hospital, don't get me wrong, but mentally, it was very, very tough coming back into the outside world. There wasn't that warm welcome that I thought there might be.
It sounds like they'd cured you, put you into remission, I should say, really, but also almost like wipe the slate clean in terms of your life and your goals, aspirations. It's almost like you had to start afresh from that time to recoup what was important to you again.
It was absolutely like having the slate wiped clean, and not by the doctors. Listen, the doctors, their role was to fix me up, which they did, and they did that brilliantly. You know, nobody expects me even to be here today. So, you know, the fact I'm here, it's a brilliant thing. But it was like, and I've seen a few films of this, it's like people who've lost their identity, and I felt my work was my identity. So I struggled for a long time to come to terms with who I was. You know, my poor wife had to bring me to hospital literally every other day. I needed treatments, I was getting infections, and I was reliant on people, and I'd always been an independent guy. You know, I relied on the nurses to help me, I relied on the doctors, I relied on my poor wife, you know, sitting there for hours on end at the hospital, driving me backwards and forwards. It was a mental torture, if I'm honest. It was a dreadful time. And it took me 6 months after leaving hospital to actually get out into the world again, because I just wasn't well enough. My immune system was so poor. I couldn't go out into public places. People had to come round and they had to wash their hands. They had to sanitize their hands before they came in. It was a very, very difficult time.
So there was a definite restriction on your lifestyle for that 6 months.
Very definitely.
After that, describe the process of getting back meaning in your life.
It was difficult because I knew that physically I wasn't the guy that I was before the process started. I mean, I was reliant on the hospital. I needed to visit the hospital very, very frequently. So that made doing anything quite difficult. I couldn't do any physical tasks. I just wasn't strong enough to do that. But I wanted to use my mind. My mind was still whirring. I had a business brain, and thankfully my business brain still works. So I discussed it with my wife, and we decided that maybe volunteering might be the way forward, where I could go and do something flexibly that allowed me to fit my hospital stuff in between. So I went to work for a cancer charity, and I learned a bit about how behind the scenes works there. But I knew that I actually wanted to help people in the front line of more like me, if you like.
Did you feel it was valuable to give back to the same community, like to the cancer world? Because some people would say, I've put that behind me, I don't want anything to do with this anymore, I want to forget about it.
Well, that's a valid point, actually. And I thought long and hard about that, because I wondered if I was doing myself any favours by continuing the cancer work when I was so heavily involved with it, personally speaking. But I knew that unfortunately cancer is a part of my life now for the rest of my days, and I'm reliant on hospital care, and I will be reliant on the hospital care till the day I'm no longer here. So putting cancer behind me, actually I can't do that anyway, because cancer is a very big part of my life. So my view was, what do I know something about? And actually now I know something about cancer. So my business head came onto me, and I thought, well, okay, no one's going to employ me. I'm unreliable health-wise. So actually I'm going to use my cancer experience to help others.
And why not? You've got skills in that area. You had contacts. You know, you can do good work and perhaps create, you know, a real change that's necessary. And one of the things we discussed is about things that are lacking or things that are missing in the system. And I'd be interested in your comment now on while we're recording this about what you think should change in the healthcare system. Having been through it yourself, you know, a few times, what could we do better in general?
If I had to sum it up in one word, actually, the coordination and collaboration. Sorry, that's 2 words. There is very little coordination and collaboration between services within the NHS and outside of the NHS, actually. Within hospital it's great, but I've also had to use services that are outside the system, and it's very disjointed, and there's very little knowledge from the service, from the NHS, of actually what is available outside. And actually, from the outside people, there's very little knowledge of how the NHS works. And there are lots of silos. You know, we hear this term silo working. There's a lot of silo working being done in cancer, which frustrates the life out of me, because first of all, we're working with extremely limited resource, both in personal basis and financially. There's also a lot of duplication, simply because the lack of communication between organisations. Many are working on very, very similar projects.
So to put this in black and white terms, if you were newly diagnosed with any cancer, the chances of a patient being able to find what resources are out there, the best resources for them, and the best person to deal with a specific problem may not be optimal. It may be it may be very poor actually in some situations as regards to supportive and psychological care. In other words, I think you described this to me previously, having access to a simple, let's say, list or menu on the internet or in a manual or brochure in the hospital, it doesn't seem to really exist, does it?
No, it doesn't exist.
It's an area where we just seem to have a dark spot, if you like, a blank for something that we should develop but haven't. And it's just amazing to me that we still have these gaps in the NHS and in terms of outside the NHS as well.
Well, the biggest problem that I see, and don't get me wrong, most of this work is done for the protection of the patient, and of course we need rules and regulations. But to me, the red tape that exists now is actually binding the professionals that I see a will to improve. I think most professionals I've talked to understand quite fully how the system lets patients down, and it must frustrate the life out of the professionals too. But there is a certain amount of brand ego that I see. In many aspects, the NHS doesn't want to be interested in something that's going on unless it has some NHS kite mark all over it, right? And large charities, they're not interested unless it's got their name written on it. So anybody that's doing wonderful work outside of those systems can absolutely be lost in the cracks. And actually, there is much more resource going on independently outside of A, large charities, and B, NHS, that actually if they all got their heads together and worked together, the patient will be far better off for that.
That's a good description. I've heard quite a lot about your story so far, but if a viewer watches it, they might get the impression you were just unwell in 2007 and then you sailed through, there's been no problems. But it's not quite as simple as that. I think you've had your fair share of complications as well. What else has been happening that we haven't mentioned so far?
Actually, it's quite true. You say that. It's quite ironic, and actually, the fact I've been in remission since my transplant. A few of my friends also they think, oh, this guy, his cancer's good. You know, why is he all the time around the hospital? And actually, the simple fact is that I have, when an organ is transplanted, so a heart or a lung or a liver or anything like that, it's something that comes from a different person. So your body recognises that, and actually, in my case, the stem cells that I received from my donor, which were there to give me a new immune system, my own immune system, the little bit that was left, actually recognises it as an enemy, believe it or not. So it starts like a civil war in my own body. So the great thing is that actually it is working. The system is working somehow, I don't know, but it's working. So it's keeping the cancer in remission. But unfortunately, fairly regularly, I have rejection issues, so which can come almost anywhere in my body. And so I've had liver failure, I've had lung failure, I've had skeletal problems with my muscles where I couldn't dress myself, I couldn't cut my own dinner. My wife had to cut my dinner and she had to dress me. I couldn't shower, I couldn't bend because all my body tightened up like an arthritic situation, which I had for 3 years. So I've had now, this is my 8th year since my diagnosis, and I've had 7 years of rejection issues. So yes, the good news is the cancer is clear, but the less positive news is that my body rejects the stuff that's actually doing me good.
So you've had this awkward condition, graft versus host disease, and it's caused some chaos in your body, I guess. Where do things stand right now regarding your health?
Well, graft versus host disease can come at any stage. So I've just finished my last bout of it. So at the moment, I don't have any graft versus host disease, but I have now major sort of skeletal weakness where I've been treated for 3 constant years to combat that. So my physical features have all changed quite dramatically. I don't have any power left, and unfortunately I can't do what I call man work. So no more DIY or bashing down walls or anything like that, and nothing too physical. I have disturbing fatigue, which is quite a problem, which I have to manage, and I have trouble with memory also. So I've had to work different coping mechanisms for the things that I do now to enable me to live some form of quality of life. During my treatment, I've lost my taste and I've lost my smell. I don't have that either. So simple pleasures of life, for example, eating out now, are quite difficult. So if I add the whole lot into the mix, actually I'm still alive, and I'm finding ways to fulfill my mental ambitions, but physically it's quite hard at times, and then sometimes it's like dragging along an anchor if you're trying to walk. It's very difficult psychologically, physically.
Do you think you found a state of acceptance about this new you that you've almost had to deal with? Somebody who's got new ambitions, different roles to before, different capabilities, different physical strength. Almost everything seems to have been affected to some degree. Have you come to terms with that?
No. No, if I'm truthful. I suffered for quite a few years, which I didn't realise. I said earlier on in the interview, I thought I was a tough guy. And I thought I can take what life throws at me, but I hadn't realised the impact on losing my work had on me. And I spoke to a professional about how I was feeling. I was feeling generally low. And they explained to me that it was like loss, they called it. And they said it's like losing something valuable from your life, okay? Which it was, I suppose. I hadn't really looked at it like that. And I don't think I'll ever accept it, if I'm truthful. I know they talk about you've got to accept it to move on, but I've moved on, but maybe not 100%. There's still a bit of me that longs for the bits that are missing.
That's fair enough. It's good to be honest about it. What does the future hold for you?
That's a good question. I don't think any of us can answer that truthfully.
Is that a trick question? I'm not sure.
No, I don't think any of us can answer that truthfully. Listen, at any stage, graft versus host disease can come back for me, right? At any stage, my cancer can come back for me because I've had 7 years in remission, or nearly 8 years now. And with my disease, that's quite rare. So I know that. So I have two shadows hanging over me, okay? But I try to move forward and try and dodge the shadows as best I can. I try and come into the sunlight. And my work that I do now, my cancer support work, my writing, my speaking, doing some conferences, doing these sort of things, has given me a new focus. And actually, I think I get my reward now from not in my wage packet, not in financial terms, but actually in this term, and helping people and seeing, measurably so actually, the difference that I can make to some people in their life. My case is quite rare, it certainly is, and I get contacted by a lot of people throughout the world now through the internet. And somebody said to me the other day, which was very heartwarming actually, that my case was a beacon for others. And actually I went to sleep nicely that night to think that I can help other people even from a distance now.
Yeah, I mean that's amazing to hear that from somebody.
It's very powerful.
Yeah, I mean personally I want to thank you for coming in today. I think you've given a valuable insight into a difficult account in a way of living with a rare cancer, which not everybody will be familiar with. But what's really powerful is your life was, in a way, wiped clean with that fresh start in a way you didn't ask for it, but you've made a new life for yourself, which is, in my eyes, at least as valuable as the one you had before. Giving back to the community, raising awareness about cancer, raising awareness about the need for psychological support, using new media to spread the word. All of that is tremendously valuable for the community as a whole. And I think, thousands of people are benefiting from the work you're doing. So I want to thank you for coming in and sharing your personal story. I think people will also find it inspirational, and I know you'll continue to do this good work. So it's wonderful to meet you, and thanks for sharing.
Thank you very much for inviting me. The honour's mine. Thank you.